The Colts' biggest nightmare is actually a recurring reality, but if it happens yet again, how might it turn out? Let's get to it.
You are Locked On Colts, your daily Indianapolis Colts podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
All right. Thanks for tuning in and making us your first listen of the day. This is your daily podcast covering your Indianapolis Colts, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. And today's show is brought to you by FanDuel. Make every moment more. As playoffs wind down, the sport stops sporting like we want them to. But this summer, FanDuel is hooking up all customers with a boost or a bonus daily. That's right. There's something for everyone every day, all summer long. Just visit FanDuel.com to get started. What's up, everybody? This is Jake Arthur from HorseshoeHuddle.com. I'm your resident member media from the website. And today we're answering some of your questions yet again. You guys sent us so much last week when we sent out the call for them in our initial episode that we're bundling it up and making this, I guess, a two-parter. So looking forward to get started on today's edition. Before we get started, though, I did want to just send out our condolences to Vikings corner Kyrie Jackson, rookie who was just kind of getting his career started. That's a guy who we spent a little bit of time talking about. If you hung with us, if you're a returning guest from before the draft and everything, I was looking back today at Zach's Build-A-Ballard thing for cornerbacks, and Kyrie was the number 3 Build-A-Ballard corner in the draft, and just a guy who really fit the Colts really well. So we did spend some time on him. Obviously, if you've heard any news around the NFL, Jackson was tragically killed in a car accident over 4th of July weekend at just 24 years old. So that's obviously terrible news to hear about anytime it comes up, but certainly a guy who had a bright young future ahead of him. So wanted to address that a little bit before we really got into the nitty gritty of this. But we're going to go ahead and move along to the questions now. Again, some of these came in from Facebook, YouTube, and Twitter. We'll go ahead to someone who put in some questions here on Twitter. This was at Zachalakin. And this is a big one. If Joe Flacco ended up starting every game this season, what do you guys think the Colts' final record would be? We'll just go ahead and play the hypothetical game here, because it's only hypothetical. Nothing is going to happen to Anthony Richardson. He's going to live in a bubble. Everything will be perfect. He's going to start all 17 regular season games, take the Colts in the playoffs, start all those. But no, so I'll take this journey with you. If Joe Flacco ended up starting every game, I do think the Colts have a pretty solid roster overall with good infrastructure. They're pretty strong in the right areas. So with a veteran quarterback like Joe Flacco, I would still put the Colts around 500, probably about 9-8, repeating that 9-8. With Anthony Richardson, I'm more likely to point towards the 10-7, get closer to the double-digit wins. I think there's less margin this year, less difference in how the offense would look. With, Richardson going out last year and it was Gardner Minshew, the offense changed pretty drastically. Now, Joe Flacco and Anthony Richardson are not stylistically the same, of course, but I do think the offense remains a little more open if you go from Richardson to Flacco than if you did with Minshew last year. Now, I'm a Flacco proponent for sure. I think this is a good backup option for Richardson. Hopefully, you don't have to see him other than in a blowout for the Colts. But I'm not going to act like Flacco hasn't been a backup for the last several years. The Browns brought him in as a lifeline, and he responded, even winning the comeback player of the year. So the last football we've seen Flacco play was awesome. But it's been a while since he was considered a starter in the NFL. And that's not just by one team. That wasn't just by the Ravens. There's other teams that had him in as backup lifeline options, essentially. So I'm not going to come out here and say that Flacco is like the biggest savior, but I don't hate the drop off if the Colts had to go to Flacco from Richardson. So I'd give it about 9-8. In this scenario, we're going to assume health for most of the Colts playmakers. Otherwise, got a strong run game with Jonathan Taylor. You got a top 5 offensive line with the Colts who that's not just us saying that. If you look around nationally this is everyone's listicle time of year, the best of this and that. The Colts rank among the top 5 in the offensive line pretty much everywhere you look right now. Really solid defensive front, which will help the secondary. So if you have a decent defense, you got a really good offensive line with a strong run game, and you got a decent group of pass catchers, which we all think the Colts do. They maybe don't, you don't have a Julio Jones out there, but you have a really good complementary group of pass catchers, plus Shane Steichen stirring the whole drink there. I do like the Colts' chances of still being a good team and, perhaps still competing for the playoffs, maybe even getting to the playoffs. Now, do you need a Richardson to probably put you over and get the AFC South title when you're competing with the CJ Strouds and everybody? Probably. But I'm not going to put it past the Colts to still be a good team if it had to be Flacco. Coming up next, Making It Rain entered a couple questions at Making It Rain 18. Does AD Mitchell supplant Alec Pierce on the depth chart by season's end? So on the depth chart, technically, probably, but I don't think that has to be the optics of it. Like, we could still see, let's say it's week 14 on, Alec Pierce still being the starter, still being the guy that goes out there first and, has a significant role. But by then, I think it's quite possible AD Mitchell is the de facto starter. You know what I mean? He probably gets the lion's share of the routes run out there. And you could tell a difference in the pecking order in the passing game that Mitchell has officially passed him. Again, technically, Pierce could still be the starter at that point of the year, but Mitchell having supplanted him where it really matters, and that's the pecking order of the passing game. So that's kind of how I see it. I don't think it's going to be I don't think that's how it's going to be right off the bat. But I think we can all see the writing on the wall that at some point Mitchell is going to be that other starting outside receiver. And then Making It Rain had another one. Who starts at safety with Julian Blackmon? So if you assume it's going to still be Julian Blackmon at strong safety, he's going to be starting one of those two. I'm going to give it to Nick Cross still. Everything I saw during the offseason program seems to point that way. While Cross and Rodney Thomas did both get first-team reps, I think it's time for the Colts to just pour those resources and all those first-team reps into Nick Cross and just see what they got. If it doesn't work, they will know it's probably never going to work at this point. Now, if he's a huge detriment and it looks like he's going to be a big problem, you have to move on from that. Like, if he's really, really struggling in camp and the preseason and everything, you have to make a move. But as long as it's not a big problem, I think you just roll with it and see what Cross gives you. There's probably more upside there. He's a decent tackler. He has good power. I think instincts and communication are I don't want to say instincts, but I guess like things you identify on film and just your comfort level and kind of bolstering that football IQ and communication are probably the things you're looking more from him. And those are things that experience is really what is going to make him better in those areas. So if it was me, I would pour more resources and reps into Cross. And I do think that's what the Colts are going to do, because so far it does seem like, from what I've seen out of practice, what they have done. And then on YouTube, we've got at JDMB a Pastor 5172. It could be Pastor. I'm just fat and thinking Al Pastor tacos, so my apologies. So he sent in several. We'll go with this first two. What rookies are getting run with the ones? Now, of course, training camp is going to be much more telling here. But so far in the handful of practices we got to watch as media during OTAs and minicamp, so AD Mitchell, again, got plenty of reps with the ones. Part of that, Pittman and Pierce both did not participate in the mandatory minicamp. Pittman obviously got banged up, had that collision where he, banged up, bruised a knee, and then Pierce got stepped on during OTAs as well. And so they kept both of those guys out. So with Mitchell or with Pierce out, with Pittman out, that's your top two outside receivers. Ashton Doolin hadn't returned yet. Mitchell got a ton of run with the ones, and it actually looked really good. Him and Anthony Richardson had quite a bit of chemistry. Latu got some run as well in kind of a NASCAR package when it seemed like the Colts were working on some late game stuff and they had their speed package of pass rushers out there. Latu was involved. And then Anthony Gould obviously is going to be heavily involved and probably going to win out as the kickoff and punt return guy. Josh Downs was involved, but you want him to take a more in on the offensive side of the ball. You don't want to kind of dump a bunch on his plate in special teams. And then Dallas Flowers as well, but he's coming off the Achilles. He's still battling it out for a starting outside corner spot with Jalen Jones. So it makes the most sense for Gould to keep getting those reps with the first team and hopefully winning out if he does claim that. Pastor's second one here, which running back is getting opportunities on third down as a blocker and as a receiver. So I'm going to point to that blocking part as what's going to probably win out, and you can also lean into special teams as well, that being between Evan Hull and Tyler Goodson. If you consider both of their receiving abilities a wash, because they're both pretty good pass catchers as running backs, those attributes are a wash. It's going to be between who's the better pass protector and who offers more on special teams. So I think Hull is probably going to have a slightly longer leash because he didn't get the benefit of developing last year because he got hurt in week 1 with that knee injury, and they spent a 4th-round draft pick on him. So while a draft pick isn't going to mean – your draft placement isn't going to mean anything if you're not earning it, the Colts certainly owe it to themselves a little more to see what they've got there because they did spend draft capital on him. So coming up next, we're going to look at more team-based questions that you guys sent in. I love sports. I love them so much that I never want them to stop. But as the playoffs wind down, we get fewer games. And the sports ain't sporting like I want them to. But FanDuel lets me keep the sports going whenever I want. Of course, you guys know what that's all about if you're out there betting all the time as well. All I got to do is open up the FanDuel app and dream up my bets anytime I'm in the mood. Plus, this summer, FanDuel is hooking up all customers with a boost or a bonus daily. That's right. There's something for everyone every day, all summer long. So, guys, let's be sickos for a second, all right? We finally get NFL preseason games in a few weeks, but the regular season is not for another 8 weeks. You can bet on the preseason. I'm sure plenty of you probably will. Hall of Fame game coming up soon. But FanDuel is already taking your bets for that regular season. Right now, Jonathan Taylor has the 2nd best odds to lead the NFL in rushing yards and the 4th best to lead in rushing touchdowns. So go out there and throw some bones on him getting both titles. Head over to FanDuel.com and start making the most out of your summer. FanDuel, official sports betting partner of Major League Baseball. All right, so let's get into the questions you guys had, kind of more team-based. This first one from Twitter, @Andis_88. What would you guys consider a successful season? Is it playoffs or bust, or would it be considered successful if Anthony Richardson continues to take steps forward as a QB, even if the Colts make the playoffs? I think this is one where Zach and I kind of differ. So Zach has always said last year and maybe even this year, because this is hopefully going to be the first extended look we get at Richardson, that it is all about Anthony and his development and this and that the product of the overall team and wins and losses is kind of on the back burner when it comes to seeing what you have with Anthony, which is true. But when I look at last year, the team was applauded and very deservedly so for getting as far as they did. I mean, they were a win away in week 18 from getting to the playoffs. I didn't consider last season a failure by any means. There's a lot of good stuff you saw. It showed a bright future, but I think you are a product of what you've shown most recently. So a dip in their record, I don't think would be satisfactory. I'm not going to say it has to be playoffs, but I think you can't see big setbacks in certain areas. Like, there's only so much you can control missing the playoffs. Like, if they have the same or a slightly better record, I definitely think you could probably consider that a success. I don't want to say the same record. It just totally depends how you look. There's so much gray area to it, and I know that's a frustrating answer. I'm a very gray area person. It just depends on what the Colts have laid out throughout the season. Like, throughout the season, if they haven't looked like they would be a deserving playoff team, that would not be a success. Even if Anthony has played throughout the year and looked like he is going to be the long-term answer, if the team hasn't looked like it should be a playoff team, I don't consider that a success. I'm not going to throw it all on the evaluation of Richardson. I think that's a huge part of it. If you get through the season and they're 9-8, 10-7, or 8-9, whatever, but it doesn't, you have questions about Richardson, I don't think that would be a successful season either. I think it would be quite unlikely if Anthony has started all your games and you are a winning team, but he doesn't look like the guy. If he's giving you Gardner Minshew, but the team record is better than his performance. Yes, that's good that's cool that the team maybe got in the playoffs right there, but you have this enormous question about your quarterback. So a lot of it does have to do with Richardson. You have to have positive vibes about him going into 2025 for it to be successful. But I think the team doing any worse than they did last year, taking any step back, I think that would be a problem, because there are also certain areas that the team ignored in the offseason because it seems like they're putting so much in the Anthony Richardson basket. Obviously, they focused 90% of their free agency on retaining their own, which is great. I think we can agree they should have brought back Pittman, Blackman, Moore, Grover, all those guys. But you didn't. When you see the rest of the AFC South doing the moves that they were making, there wasn't a lot of urgency there. And we know the Colts build through the draft, but it just wasn't a good look. So if those chickens come home to roost, and it doesn't, and it looks like that was a mistake to not be a little more active in trying to find outside weapons in the offseason, I don't think that would be a good look. So next one, this is from @IndyMimi58. What are the Colts' biggest needs and how will they fill them? So they did address some things in the draft, short-term and long-term. I don't think you have many concerns about edge depth now because you did Kwity Paye's fifth-year option. You drafted Latu. Samson Ebukam still has a year, and so you really only have to focus on Dayo Adangbo when it comes to edge depth in the short term. But the Colts do still have some corner and safety questions, I think. Now, I'm going to kind of lay off the cornerback stuff because it's kind of a moot point. The Colts truly feel like they've got their guys at corner, and I think they feel like what they've done to the defensive front will help the corners immensely. I don't think the Colts see corner as an issue whatsoever. I think they know they're young, but they like the guys they have. Safety, on the other hand, I don't think they're as confident. You don't really, you haven't really gotten the confident answers about safety that they've given from corner. They're kind of just looking for Nick Cross or Rodney Thomas to step up and have a firm grip on that free safety role next to Julian Blackman. But for me, Blackman has really never had a full season in his career. He's played the vast majority of seasons. It's not like he's a chronically injured player. Like, he's played most of his seasons. But he's had injury issues. You know that. And you don't know who the free safety is next to him. Nick Cross is not someone you've had confidence in giving the starting job to before. So safety is the biggest question mark for me still. You could still add someone like Justin Simmons, and it would not hurt the team whatsoever. You could add Quandre Diggs. It would not hurt the team. I don't think I would add a starting level corner at this point, again, because I don't think the Colts see it as a problem, and I just don't. It's not realistic to me anymore. And then another just minor thing is running back depth. If Jonathan Taylor gets hurt, which over the last couple seasons that has been a problem, are you rolling with Trey Sermon and Tyler Goodson and Evan Hull? Because that's not the most dangerous running back room in the world. They probably are a little more confident in being able to pick up a running back somewhere and use him. Running back is a pretty translatable. I'm not going to say it's an easy position, but it's one where you don't have to pour a lot of resources in to get productivity, especially with the offensive line the Colts have. So when you're looking at it, running back depth, and then the depth in your secondary is probably your biggest areas in need. Next up from @Matt1214B, how often and when in the yearly cycle of practice, both at the facility and away, which I'm guessing means training camp, do the offensive and defensive lines, their first teams, go against each other? And how does bad play get masked like the O-line a few years back when the camp reports weren't terrible, but the in-season play was? And how important are those reps? So I will say when the Colts line was really, really bad in 2022, at no point, like in training camp or anything, did us in the media think it was going to look good. I mean, it looked poor. Guys were getting through constantly. The defensive front was constantly winning in training camp. So it is hard to evaluate in training camp in the preseason. But what you have to look at is those first team reps during live 11 on 11s, because one-on-ones aren't necessarily realistic either, because you're not going one-on-one, you're going 5-on-5, and the scheme is always such a team thing that one-on-ones is more of an exercise and evaluation for the coaches than it is true evaluation of how the unit as a whole is going to be. But they really get after it starting in training camp when the pads get on, because I think the CBA says you just can't really be that active and fully engaged throughout the offseason. They do some strategic and light stuff during the offseason, but in earnest, first team versus first team offense, first defensive lines doesn't really get started until training camp, and it goes throughout the season, I suppose. We don't get to watch full practices when the season begins because there's just so much strategy involved that, for privacy reasons, teams do not open full practices throughout the actual regular season. But I imagine there's some work that goes into it. But the evaluation process changes different. It changes from. You're kind of just not just evaluating your roster, but you're trying to see who's going to be on your team during training camp. You are still getting ready for the regular season. But when the regular season hits, your sole focus is on that next opponent. So hopefully that answers your question a little bit. The times when they're most getting after it is during training camp. The last one for this segment: what are the reasonable expectations for last year's late round flyers and undrafted guys? Mentioning specifically Jake Witt, Scott, which I'm going to say Xavier Scott on this one, just because Daniel Scott unfortunately did suffer an Achilles injury recently and is out for the year. So Jake Witt, Xavier Scott, Titus Leo, and Evan Hull. And then this year's as well, I just threw a few out there for this year: Jalen Carlisle, Jonah Laulu, Micah Abraham, and Jalen Simpson. So reasonable expectations for these guys. So for Jake Witt and Titus Leo, I'll lump them together. I'm expecting the practice squad for those guys. Both of them, you hope to see improvement. They're both on IR all last year. So this is kind of their first healthy year of development. I think practice squad is the way for them. They're both members of pretty deep position groups, so it's hard to say they're going to make it. I think it would be more likely for them to be moved on to the practice squad once training camp's over. Xavier Scott, perhaps him as well. He spent time on the practice squad last year. Didn't make the roster. Was kind of the last guy in the running back group last year. But he was transitioning from wide receiver back to running back. This is a guy who you're probably looking at as maybe a couple-year development project. So he could make the practice squad as well. But unfortunately, the reps behind Jonathan Taylor seem a little more open, but I don't know how much of a contender Scott is for that yet. I mean, he could change my mind. I just haven't seen him make enough big plays for me to think he's super in the mix there. And then Evan Hull, reasonable expectations for him is, I think it's up to him to claim the RB3 spot behind Taylor and Trey Sermon. I think everything is there for him to earn that third down passing back role. Again, like I mentioned, him and Tyler Goodson, their receiving abilities are probably a wash. Just take that off the table. Who's the better guy in pass protection and who contributes more on special teams? I think for those two, that's really what it's going to come down to during camp. And then looking at Carlisle, Laulu, Abraham, and Simpson. Carlisle, I think, realistically could carve out a defensive role this year. Linebacker 3 seems kind of open next to Zaire Franklin and EJ Speed. They do need a linebacker who looks the part in pass defense. So between Carlisle and Ronnie Harrison, I think that's kind of open. Maybe he plays like 200 snaps or so defensively. I think his biggest thing is probably going to be special teams, but I definitely expect him to make the roster if he does his part. Laulu, that's a practice squad guy for me. He's a versatile guy. He needs some stability. It seems like he came from Hawaii to Oklahoma, moved around a ton. I think if you just work on this guy for a year or so, keep him on the interior and just see what he can give you. Maybe looking in 2025 is more appropriate for him. Abraham and Simpson. So this is interesting. In my roster prediction that I did, my 53 roster, I had Abraham making it as the backup nickel, beating Chris Lamons. And then Jalen Simpson, I had him losing out to Daryl Baker. I think it's really important to have a backup nickel. I think you can find more guys to kind of play the backup outside corner spot. I think you have more guys there. I just didn't see as much from Simpson so far during the spring. That's not an indictment on him. I mean, these guys are brand new. Training camp is really where we're going to start seeing what they can do. But Abraham has really special abilities in taking the ball away, which can't be taught. He's got a pretty similar athletic profile to Kenny Moore. Not saying he's Kenny Moore, but his redeeming quality is his ball skills. So if he can beat out Chris Lamons, which I think is an easier path to the roster than Simpson has at beating Daryl Baker and those other guys competing for outside spots, that's kind of my expectations of them. Coming up, I know it's kind of a supersized episode. I didn't want to cheap anyone on their answers. But coming up here in a minute, we're going to kind of get to our miscellaneous random questions before we finish this thing up. All right, next one, again from Twitter from @sholmes84501. It's kind of gone under the radar, but I think the Texans hiring Nate Ollie is huge. He knows the Colts defense inside and out and how the Colts aim to defend Houston. Am I overthinking this? So Ollie was the Colts defensive line coach, obviously, previously. But also the Texans do have Ron Miles' son, Ryan Miles, now as well. So the Texans do have a couple assistants in their coaching staff who have pretty vast understanding of either the Colts system or personnel there. So Nate Ollie obviously was their defensive line coach last year. He is now assistant defensive line coach in Houston. Ryan Miles, the son of Ron Miles, the Colts DB coach. I don't want to say it's nothing, but I don't think it's enough for the Colts to worry about. I mean, this is life in the NFL. Everybody knows everybody. And I really don't mean this to poo-poo on anyone, but like, it is a nepotism league. It's a who you know league. So again, everybody knows everybody. Every team has something on every team. There's familiarity everywhere. So I don't think it's enough for teams really to worry about. Does Ollie know their personnel and everything? Absolutely. But defensive line is a really important coaching position. And I think Charlie Partridge, how he's going to have his guys working is different from how Nate Ollie had them going. So Ollie does know the defense. He knows the players, but I'm just not really worried about it. There's enough newness there to where I don't think it's going to be a big deal. At the end of the day, players have to beat players. Strategy is kind of, execution is the biggest thing. The players have to go out there and do it regardless of what the game plan is. Next up from @JosephJackson1459 on YouTube. fully explain the rule changes with kickoffs and how that impacts the camp roster and potentially impacting the 53. So I'm not going to get into a whole big thing, just kind of the cliff notes. So the kickoff comes from the kicking team's own 35-yard line. That's just the kicker, though. The rest of the kickoff team is going to line up at the receiving team's 40-yard line, so across the field. Meanwhile, the return team, it's usually going to be about 9 guys, is going to line up 5 yards away in between their own 35 and 30-yard lines. They have a little zone there. You're going to have a maximum of 2 guys who can line up in what is considered the it's like the receiving zone, I think it is. But that is from the receiving team's goal line to 20-yard line. So landing zone is what it was called. There's no fair catches, and you can only do onside kicks in the fourth quarter by the losing team that has to report it to the referees. So it's going to look more like a run play, really, like a glorified run play. The NFL did this to bring back kickoffs because last year, I think, was the lowest kickoff return rate ever in NFL history. But they also wanted to do something safe. So they feel like this is a way to bring kickoffs back while, eliminating an abundance of injuries and what they say to kind of bring kickoffs back to being more in line with a normal NFL scrimmage play in terms of injury rate. So it's going to resemble more of a run play, I think. Zach and I have discussed this a little bit in terms of, there might be small things impacting the 53-man roster. Like maybe you keep an extra tight end, maybe an extra linebacker. The really athletic guys who maybe can't cut it offensively or defensively, but that you could do something with them on special teams. Those guys maybe have a little more of a chance doing this. We discussed like Adatome, for example, being like a lead blocker or something seems like the funnest idea. But yeah, I think there are small ways it could impact the 53. We just don't know yet because this is the first year of it. So we'll keep an eye on that. Next one from @HeavyMetalPunk on YouTube. When will Reggie Wayne finally get his due and enter the Hall of Fame? And then will Robert Mathis also get his due from the Hall? So this one's tough because, there's always this logjam of receivers, especially guys having to wait their turn. It seemed like last year was really going to be the year that was Reggie's turn to shine. He's been a finalist now for a few years. Robert Mathis was a semifinalist last year as well. I think Reggie will eventually get in, hopefully soon. Robert Mathis probably has a tougher time. I'm going to, it's always a matter of who they have to go up against, who is going to get in ahead of them. So right now, I was looking at Pro Football Reference's Hall of Fame monitor, and they kind of assign a grade to guys who are most deserving of getting in. Reggie Wayne and Torrey Holt have a higher score than the average Hall of Fame wide receiver. And they're the only two not in there yet. So you hear those two mentioned all the time. So I want to say within the next couple years, we're going to see Reggie get in there. Hopefully, he gets in there before you have like Larry Fitzgerald and some of these bigger name guys who you got to get in. So hopefully Reggie soon. Mathis might have to wait a bit because, Reggie's got to go up against, Holt, Anquan Bolden, Steve Smith, and Hines Ward. That's a bunch of really, really good players who a lot of them are eventually deserving, but Reggie's probably the best of the group. But when you look at Mathis, I think he's eventually deserving as well, but he's got like Terrell Suggs is coming up on his first year, I think. Clay Matthews, Jared Allen, James Harrison. Like I think he's got a pretty tough road. So Reggie, I think will eventually get in. Mathis may be one of those guys that has to wait a ton of time or just winds up in the Hall of very good. Last one here from, again, the @JDMBA Pastor 5172. Are there any position groups on other teams that you're watching for veteran camp cuts? You had mentioned a good example here, the safeties for X team because Ballard had a higher grade on this player, for example. The guys we kind of circle, it never winds up being them. You get your sneaky ones like Mike Adams or Rodney McLeod, those type of ones that come up that you never really saw coming. So I won't name anyone specifically, but I do think safety is the most likely one. You could see a backup running back in there for the reasons I mentioned earlier, but I think safety is probably the most up in the air position group on the entire roster. You only have one guy you're confident in starting in Blackman, but he's someone who's struggled with injuries during his career. The other guy who we think is probably going to start in Nick Cross has not been trusted to be a full-time starter before. And actually, he earned that spot as a rookie, but got benched in like week 2 or 3 for Rodney McLeod. And then the depth scares you too, especially after Daniel Scott went down for the season. So I would keep an eye on safeties. It's a weird position around the league because there's like a lot of free agents out there right now. But if there's any team with like a handful of really good ones, or there's like, a team where some safety pops up out of nowhere and really shines and kind of boots a veteran off the roster come camp cut time, I could definitely see safety kind of, I don't want to say a facelift, but we could see a couple new names to that group there. So this was a mega-sized episode today. Sorry about that, guys. But remember, Locked On has launched the first ever national sports 24/7 streaming channel on YouTube. And now it's also available on Amazon Fire TV and the free Fire TV channels app. Locked On Sports Today is here for you 24/7, covering the top sports stories of the day with the local experts of Locked On, plus our national shows covering every league. Find Locked On Sports Today now available on the free Fire TV channels app. If you don't already follow at Locked On Colts, at Jake Arthur NFL, and at Zach Hicks 2 on Twitter. Get Locked On Colts on Instagram and TikTok as well. Subscribe here on YouTube and wherever you listen to podcasts if you don't already. We would also love your ratings and reviews as well. Just got a new one like yesterday or the day before. That very much warmed my heart. It was very, very nice of you guys. So keep those coming because after all, I do not ever get tired of hearing compliments. And with that, you guys have a great day, and we will see you guys tomorrow.